Good day to you. This is Anna Galactic bringing you the secrets of the universe on this second Sunday in June 2025 from Chico, California. Over here you'll see a simple diagram which looks like a curve. It's two curves. This represents the cutting edge of physics today at the limit of what science is able to understand. You're looking at the quantum. You're looking at a lot more than that. You're looking at two conjugal infinities. I will be describing that to you so it doesn't sound like gobbledygook. The way that I was able to get at an interpretation of this most important diagram was through the discovery of a conjugal number system that's quite similar to the complex number system, but with several advantages. It turns out that this is indeed the binary number system. It is different from the linear number system in that, first of all, it is a subset of the linear numbers. Linear numbers are correctly defined as one component numbers. These may be perceived as the counting numbers, that is the simplest of the number systems, which does not have a zero because you can't count something that is not there. The last successful employment of the linear number system to make any progress at all was by Paul Adrien Maurice Dirac, whose book I read and fully understand. What Paul was trying to find out was a method of probing the quantum limit of measurement. This, of course, is at the subatomic level, where it is absolutely predictable, although nobody ever did predict it. The number system must break. The discovery of that fact is probably the greatest discovery in the history of mathematics or physics. It is my discovery, but I have several dozen major discoveries, all based on a direct perception of reality. So I will be covering that when we get to the synthetic stage, in which science actually is in now, but no man has yet reached the synthesis, except one. I have. And I have reached the synthesis stage for all of science, for all of history, to end the quest of mankind for the truth of the universe. What you're looking at over here is technically the strong force. However, your physicists simply cannot penetrate that mystery. And the reason is you're looking at a curve, and a curve is not susceptible to one component mathematics. So this curve is a two-component number. It is representable in my number system, but of course it's not mine. The binary number system is used in CPU technology, which generates the image that you're looking at. So the linear number system was given by Allah. There's no question that Allah forced us to learn the linear number system first, for the best. However, it has a limit. And we reached that limit exactly in the year 1900. An amazing benchmark because 1900 is a very easy year to remember. That is the year that science disintegrated, and it has not recovered. It's been 125 years since the end of science. Now, what has happened is given the name of science because it comes under the umbrella of general science. However, science has different levels. There are different classes of science. There's different levels. At the bottom level is mathematics, which is only included in the realm of science because it's such a useful tool. But science itself is something that very few men sit down to think about why they're doing it at all. In the United States, the default is money, of course. And even Galileo used his scientific insights. He did perfect the telescope, which had been invented in the Netherlands, but he perfected it, so he does deserve his title of the discoverer of telescopy, although that's always a tricky thing to assign to one man, because it's never one man. But that's how we benchmark history. So the reason I bring up Galileo is he sold his telescope to the Italian Navy. And he couldn't care less what they were going to do with it. Of course, it was going to be used for warfare. And that's the name of the game today. Nothing has changed. That's been about 400 years, so this is really nothing new. That people do science for money, to make a living, to survive. There's nothing wrong with that. I said that several times. But in science, you have to learn the principle of superpositional logic. Anything you say and assert will be wrong because you're using linear logic. The universe doesn't use that. So this is a change to the human consciousness, which affects directly our perception of reality. That's what we wanted. That was the goal of science. So I achieved that. I'm the first man to do so. This goes not only deep, it goes to the ultimate limits of everything we know or understand. I've solved all of the equations. There's no question about it, but you need to know why. Because just because a man raises his voice or shows histrionics to get attention, that does not change anything. The bottom line in science is the proof. You have to get that, otherwise it's not science. Science at the highest level. Now it begins with you as a human, and therefore, to the day of my death, I will be preaching at you in order to torture you with religion. You need it. You must have it. And I'm going to make you itch. I'm going to make you sweat. I'm going to talk about what you need for you based on what the universe says. And I'm the only man who can tell you that. I'm Islam, so you can trust me. I will not be talking about that today because my purpose in presenting this brief series, which will go to more than one lecture, but I always like to keep my videos self-contained to deliver valuable information to you. You don't have to do any homework, but you do have to think. All right, so what this diagram purports to show can be analyzed from any number of approaches. The technological approach is to regard this as the strong force, which I need to describe to you. This is in Wikipedia, and they admit they're very good at this. Wikipedia is a good source in general. And this is taken from Wikipedia on the nuclear force, which they rightly disambiguate in the first paragraph. Your physicists do not understand what they're looking at. That is the very first realization that you must achieve. The nuclear force is ambiguous because there's more than one. That is admitted, but I'm the only one who can disambiguate it completely. So I'm giving you a lot of top-notch stuff right now to allure you so you'll keep listening. But without the proof, it's all in vain. You won't believe it. You must not believe it without the proof. So I'm getting to that. But in order to get to it, I must remind you that this is the most difficult problem that's ever been faced by humanity. In the realm of science, at the top of the list, as that's where I'm at. So I'm giving you the cutting edge of science where it breaks. And I'm going to show you how it breaks so that you'll know why everything has gone haywire. Perhaps you've picked up the book by David Bohm, who gives probably the best mechanical presentation of the quantum mechanics system. Perhaps you've picked up the book by Dirac, where he explains how he did things to get his superpositional analytical overview, which was so miraculous that he's hailed as a demigod to this day, and correctly so. But that's really where it ended. Just to give you a little background on Dirac and Bohm, Bohm basically resurrected the de Broglie model, which is a pilot wave model that attempts to unify the concept of the wave and the particle. That, of course, nothing works, but that's a good one. And de Broglie was talked down at the Solvay conference. He was just humiliated and he gave up. But he was still alive when Bohm resuscitated it and showed that, no, that has value. So that's Bohm. As for Dirac, he is the keystone to all of quantum mechanics. if you want to understand the problems of quantum mechanics, and that's all we have are problems. But in order to sort it out in some way, to come to some rational apprehension of what the hell is going on, Paul Dirac sums it up. He died an extremely frustrated man, although he was a well-balanced man. You can see that I identify with Paul Dirac. A very good book to read about Paul Dirac, very strongly recommended reading, is by a man named Fermello, and he wrote a book called The Strangest Man, and that indeed is Paul Dirac. Okay, to get back to this diagram, I'm going off on several tangents just to let you know this is an inductive sequence to the hardest problem ever faced by mankind, which now we know cannot be solved. I'm going to show you why it can't be solved. Nobody remembers the ancient path. Why are we doing this? And now we've reached the end. It's been 125 years of stagnation. Technology surges forward. Just so you know, you don't have to accept this, but I'm just going to tell you as a wise man whose duty it is to tell you the truth in all respects, technology is absolutely controlled by Satan. Technology is satanic. And the reason there are hadron colliders is because Satan is getting ready to act. And the fact that human beings are in outer space right now, I'm sure you're aware that several countries have a massive presence in the area around Earth. That is purely satanic. Man does not want to go into outer space. Elon Musk is a devil. You must not even look at his face. These men are trained hypnotists. They're here to hurt you. All of your scientists are on the side of evil. That is simply the way it is, children. So you have to know with what you're dealing. Technology is not science. Okay, I hope you understand that. Remember, there are levels, and human language allows such classificational systems that even mathematics is called science, even Hadron Collider particle accelerator experiments is called science, and outer space research is called science. Yes, but it's superpositional. And this has to do with the fact that humans don't think correctly. You have to think superpositionally. What does it mean? There are always two sides to everything. And you have to state both sides, to yourself even. So when you're talking about an electron, there is no possibility of understanding an electron without understanding the proton. So then you have a tough choice. Which one do you understand first? The correct answer is the proton, but that's because superposition is hierarchical. There's a hierarchy to superposition. So this has to do with two forces. And it also has to do with a space perception. Now, to resume my inductive bracketing course, which may wear you out, I'm sorry, but this is the hardest problem that's ever been faced in science. You're not going to get a little lollipop that has the formula for all of reality on it at the end. You're going to get something much better. My aim is to transform your mind while you're sitting there. If I can accomplish that, I would be quite pleased, because you're going to be pleased. Wouldn't you like to understand? Okay, so understanding comes at a price. You have to work for it. But in deductive logic, you have all the facts in front of you. That's where physics is at. All the information we need for synthesis, we have already discovered. There's nothing further to discover, and nothing ever will be discovered again, further than what we already know. We already know everything there is to know about the universe out to the edge of infinity. We know everything in terms of data. That's knowledge, which is a heap. It's like a heap of bits of information. Well, then you have to use your mind to put them together. That is the secret of science. is relationships, sometimes shortened to relations. So what's the relation that we're seeing here? It's between a force and distance. A force and distance. Now, that is also the meaning behind the redshift. That it's a linear relationship between distance and what? Do you know? I'll give you a few seconds to think about that. It's the same thing. It's the relation between distance and force. What force? What's the force here? And what's the force involved in redshift? Do you know? This is just feeding the inductive sequence whereby we can get a wide enough range of arranged facts to put them together. So then you will see its vision. People who are blind have this same system, the same visual perceptual system. There are a lot of two-ness things involved in elementary physics. Electroforce and magnetoforce combine at a right angle to form electromagnetic manifestation, which if you've ever used two magnets, you realize cannot possibly be understood by the mind of man. I will show you how to understand it with your mind of man. But don't forget, you're trying to raise your mind to a much higher level. It's easy in a way because you're already using it, but it's hard to distinguish between linear logic and synthetic logic. Linear logic is sequential, so you deduce things from facts, like Sherlock Holmes. But inductive it's the converse. It's not the reverse or inverse or opposite. It's this conjugality again, where you're trying to relate two ideas because the only way you can perceive reality is by relations. The most celebrated example of that today on the pseudoscience circuit is the inordinate concentration on the concept of reality. Reality is being manipulated by very powerful forces, none of which are good. It's to confuse you. It's the right path, but there's a wrong method. So this is giving you a lot of information. Again, this is the hardest problem ever faced by man. I am the only man who has the right approach. But to summarize how this will work in the interpretation of this most important diagram ever, this actually is a computer generated, I was going to say ever drawn by the hand of man. That curve represents reality. The straight line, which is horizontal, the red line points off to infinity, spatially. So the 0 point is, of course, way over on the left. That 0 does not exist, and that's why the blue line cannot reach it. This is the collision range of two protons. So this shows the spatial separation of two protons, which in physical space is a spherical separation because both objects are spheres. And so you have to compute that using two-component mathematics, or you can't. You'll get the calculus if you don't begin with two-componency, and you'll have to use the calculus because the calculus is a transdimensional operator. Because we're using linear mathematics, we're forced to use a linear grid that organizes space into cubes. That's why the problem of the solution to the cubic equation was so important for centuries, and it was finally solved in a certain sense, although it's not a solution, with essentially the Riemann zeta function, which has not been solved and cannot be solved. We have several of these paradoxes in mathematics that cannot be solved. They just exist, and therefore it has to be the explanation. Well, you have to know the limitations of the system you're using. If you're using one componency numbers, then you have to construct space into cubes. Well, that's no match. And you can get away with it because it works on Earth because you don't need anything relativistic. But when you're starting to talk about reality down to the proton level and electron level, you're forced into the actual number system, which I discovered. It's quite simple. And it does use linear numbers, which we knew at least from the work of von Neumann. And it's really, that represents a whole list of names. It is now known that computability is the key to reality. In the use of our number system, what we're attempting to do is match physical reality with a model in our minds. That can't be done with cubes, because the universe isn't made of cubes. That's called an extrinsic geometry, and you're forced to single componency. The fact that that cannot break the barrier is what generated the complex number system, which is a two-component number system. The x-axis is standard single-component linear numbers, the same way we learned in school, but the vertical aspect of the plane has a different metric, and you know that's the square root of -1. There are immensely profound reasons why that is a miraculous discovery, that this two-componency number system called the complex number system captures a circular function using Euler's function. Euler's function uses exponentiation. There's a reason for that. It's related to the square root of -1 in order to get a perfect rate, which is the result of doing the calculus in its original use by Newton, was to get a rate. And you know what a rate is? It is a two-component number. Whenever you take a derivative, for instance, to get a curve, and it could be the circle, and that would be the best example, but usually what you're shown in school is some like a parabola or some strange curve. It's not simple. And the idea is to get that with a linear number extraction. Well, that can't be done because the curve does not exist in linear space. And that's the meaning, essentially, in this sense. There are many senses, and I'm going to cover them all as much as I can. You see that that curve cannot be computed. That is the quantum paradox. Is that curve that you're looking at is what cannot be seen. So this cannot be understood. I'll now show you how to understand it. The curve is a two-componency line. It has to be because it's not straight. Nowhere on that curve is it straight. There are two asymptotes here, showing the relationship between actual physical space and our linear deconstruction on a 2D plane. A 2D plane is already incorrect because you've divided the plane into two linear numbers, x and y. That's incorrect. That needs to be integrated because you're trying to get the rate of whatever you're looking at. It's always a two-componency number that gives you the geometry because it's curved, because it's spherical. This is a projection downward from spherical space. That's why it looks like a corkscrew. And the way to interpret this blue line is part of the paradox. Is how do you do that? Well, there are two infinities in conjugal relation. And this will be an aspect of my discovery of the rationalization of infinity, which is a dual paradox. And your scientists and mathematicians are too stupid to see what's right in front of their faces. They're highly motivated to remain stupid because they're trying to survive, okay? So a little compassion is called for here. Not really. There's no compassion in science. You make a mistake, you pay. You pay hard. And anybody who listens to you will be equally misled by your stupidity. That's exactly what's happened. It's just remarkable. It's almost magical. There's such a large group of super intelligent men who are bred for the purpose of doing mathematics for the government cannot see reality at the mathematic level. They cannot perceive the limitation of their own numbers. Unbelievable situation, but I've solved it. And the binary number system is the only number system that can parameterize the plane. Because when you use the binary number system, which is a subset of the linear numbers that are perfectly rational, there's no zero in this system. In a CPU system, you have a double zero causing a division by zero error. It's extremely profound. And I was a computer scientist for 2 decades. I studied this for months. On my own recognizance, I just wanted to know what caused a division by zero error. It's an amazing journey to find out the answer to that, and you never do get quite a straight answer. It was only after I was exposed to the work of John Horton Conway, the greatest mathematician of the 20th century, he discovered the definition of a linear number. And in his system called the surreal number system, on day 2 of creation, which is a profound way to approach this problem, he generates from the +1 -1 on day 1, which originates with a +0 -0 on day 0. On the first day of creation of numbers, you get the entire linear number system, essentially, with its polaric relationship on 180 degrees plus minus, that's charge. And this diagram has a lot to do with charge relationship, as you'll come to see. So on day 2, what happens when the 1 splits? From day 0 to day 1, the 0, which is a virtual split, an active genius that establishes the basis of nonlinear geometry according to my discovery. John did not understand what he discovered. I understand what he discovered. So on day 1, you get a split 1. That's why +1 and -1 add to 0. On day 2, he only has 2 rules for these generative steps, which capture an infinity of infinities of numbers. The first man to achieve closure on infinity in the number system in any sense, Cantor, failed. He merely distinguished between ordinal and cardinal counting of infinities. John Horton Conway showed geometrically where all the infinities are in the linear number system. The definition of a line. Okay, that's why the line is so important. It contains all the one-component number systems. Happily, and this is the key insight, it also contains a subset of those numbers, which is an infinity of numbers, single-component numbers. There has to be a balance between the numbers. Otherwise, there's no relational system. On the line, there is, by definition, no relativity. That's actually profound because we're getting to the definition of light speed, which is a 2-component number. I don't know if you're aware of that. Okay, so the linear number system splits on the index to plus and minus. That's a mistake. There's no such thing as negative numbers. But if you start with linear construction, you're forced to it eventually. And that's why we have the complex number system. One of the greatest mistakes ever made by the sinful mind of man is the development of the complex number system. It does have its place in technology, obviously. The complex number system, in case you didn't know this, is the only number system that's allowed in physics. In mathematical physics or physical mathematics, you can say it either way, you must use the complex number system. That will take you years to master, and no one ever perfectly masters it because it's irrational. It destroys your mind. And that's why your mathematicians, one I'll just say, etiology of their current state of psychosis is because their numbers have driven them insane. You must master the complex numbers. It's the only number system left in use. Well, that's kind of remarkable since all the computers we use binary numbers, which are 2-component numbers. That's the secret. I'm going to show that to you geometrically, and that will explain this curve, which looks like a corkscrew because it's a transition between 2 spherical dimensions. You may know that the Einstein equation for relativity is a 3-1 split because it is premised on 3D space, which is already a mistake. So there's already several mistakes. We use the wrong number system. We use the wrong geometry. Is it any wonder nobody can understand the curve? Well, not only do you need the complex numbers, you must use it exclusively now. Paul Dirac did. Now we turn to Einstein. His problem was not so much complexity, although it is a complexified system. A four-component representation of space-time has three spatial dimensions. Well, that means that time has to be negative. That's a mistake. Although I'll show you why it works. It actually does work for local space. Without special and general relativity, spaceflight would be impossible. So this is satanic. And that's why the complex number system was developed, is so Satan could get into outer space to complete his plan. And that's what's happening. The Chinese have landed on the far side of the moon. I don't know if you're aware of that. They're setting up a communication system. God knows why. Because none of the stuff out in outer space is essentially aimed at the education of mankind. We get the crumbs that fall from the master's table. Well, the master down here is Satan. That's what controls science. And that's what controls your life and your mind. You'll have to fight your way out of it. I'm going to show you the easy way out. It's through the blueprinted rational logic system that your creator put into you with DNA so that you could match his mind. And if that's of value to you, you're in the right place, because I'm the only man that shares that mind right now before I die. I'm sorry, but I do have to interject these commercial announcements. All right, so that's a curve, and it can only be understood with a two-component number approach, because it's a relationship. Well, that's not what is done, because you have to get a computable answer. Well, only the linear numbers are computable. Von Neumann essentially proved that. There's several ways to prove that. Well, one of them is just the existence of the CPU. But does it use the linear number system? Which one? There are at least 8. And you get different opinions on how many number systems there are, but you've heard of the rational numbers. What are those? It depends on how you define it. We call them fractions, and we were taught in school that that's division. That's an error. So we were not taught the operators correctly. It's just so you have a little help here. The line only uses add, because the Archimedean is 0. It's the balance of two infinities on a line. You don't want that. What you want is the balance of two infinities on the plane. And that would be the center and the edge. Since there is no known edge to space, we're simply talking about space so that we can get time in here. We're going to space-time using the binary number system, because only the binary number system represents light speed. So it's the only way to perceive reality directly is with a two-component number system. But it's not the rational numbers. The rational numbers comprise a two-component number system, which we call division, which is a mistake. It's proportion. So the rational number system is correct. However, there are other problems with the linear number system besides 0. We cannot use 0, and our CPUs prove that, but we actually know now that 0 does not really exist as a number. It's not a real number. So 0 is a severe problem. It's because it's the Archimedean of the system, which means it kind of shares both positive and negative in something that has no dimension. That's how Euclid defined it. That's how it's accepted to this day. You have a point that has no dimensions. Well, you can't do that. That simply doesn't exist. And the binary number system proves that. Because if you're going to compose a two-number system, that is a two-componency number system, very similar to the complex number system, you could consider rational numbers, which are two-component numbers, one in the numerator and one in the denominator. That represents a relationship. Consider 1 over 2. It's the relationship of 1 to 2. This is non-commutative. But actually, you'll see there is an interesting aspect to commutativity that has baffled your mathematicians forever. You've heard of non-commutative algebra. It's in some way necessary, and the conjugality of complex space is based on a specific cross multiplication of the two components, one of which is considered to be imaginary. The coefficients to the two terms in a complex number are both linear numbers, but the basis is different, and that's very odd. It will destroy your mind if you study it too long. Complex number system is essentially so bad that it's poisonous, and now it's the basis of science itself. So that's a direct contradiction. So either all of science is wrong, or I am flat out wrong. There's no in between. Yes, there is, and that's the secret of superposition. Both systems are true at the same time, and in a certain extreme form of superposition, that can violate light speed. And that's the secret of the collapse of the wave function, which I will be showing you today, so that you know. And I'll also work in the quantum of gravity. I discovered how to solve the collapse of the wave function, which Paul Dirac failed to do, and how to define the quantum of gravity, which no man will ever do, except me. I'm the only one who knows and can prove it. In science, you have to prove it. So I do begin with a binary number system because it is the correct number system within the linear number system, which again, the linear number system is all the number systems. What about the complex number system? No, it's nowhere. John Horton Conway dealt with this. It was probably his most extreme agony when he almost had it. But then there are these imaginary numbers. He found out a way to put it on the tree using a strict, rational, generative tree. That's called the surreal number tree. Surreal, that word is a play on real. The real numbers are not real. The real numbers are infinitely dense with non-numbers. An irrational number is not a number. And so you cannot just use the rational number system, because 1 over 3 is non-representable. So you have to use a base 2 system that's so profound, it may give you enlightenment right now just thinking about that. So, when you start with your first two-component number, what would it be? 1 over 1. So that is a new Archimedean that replaces 0. Instead of it being the additive identity, which exists only on the line because of the two polar infinities defined by the line, instead you're using a center that is not 0. It's a 1. And that's the center number of the binary number system. There is no 0, because you cannot relate 0 to 0. You cannot have 0 over 0. There's no such number, and therefore it is not in the binary number system. That's why every CPU has to have a special function built in, which is highly costly, which is to guard against a division by 0 error. Because if you send a division by 0 instruction to any CPU, it stops. It's called a halt condition. It's frozen. You have to unplug it and plug it back in to reboot. And then don't divide by 0, or it will stop every time. So that's the universe's way of saying you've got a real serious problem with your linear number system. The way out of that is to use the binary number system as the basis of everything, not just computation. This is extremely profound, and I'm going to show you why right now. If you have a 0, which Euclid did not define, but in effect he did, because even though he wasn't talking about linear dimensions, like 2 linear dimensions for the plane, it's implied he knew about it, and the 3 linear number system for volume space, cubic space. He knew about that, but he didn't use numbers. Not really. It was pure geometry. So he said it had no dimensions. Well, that's a zero. Zero what? Zero dimensions. Well, then it's not there. Correct? Well, that's the strange aspect of zero, which was not discovered for centuries after Euclid. Euclid had no concept of zero, but obviously he did. He knew that the point had to be defined as zero dimensions. He just didn't think that way. Well, we don't know that. Maybe he did. You know why this is such a strange aspect of Euclidean axiomatization? Is because everything is superpositional. So when you say that zero does not exist, you also have to say that it does exist. Because in the systematic use of the line for distance, you have to have a zero or you can't measure the distance to anything. So zero is virtually there. That was not discovered for centuries, which is somewhat amazing that it took so long. And then the negative numbers were developed before zero. Of course, it was called a tool of the devil. There's no such thing as a negative distance. There's no such thing as a negative quantity. That is true. And the binary number system can be set up with a special method, and it is, such that there are negative numbers. That's a mistake. There are no negative numbers in the binary number system if it's constructed correctly, because the concept of negativity is polar. Polar, that's 180 degrees. That's incorrect. Although it does exist in the universe in the explosion of a black hole, which I discovered, the explosion of a supermassive black hole. But it looks like there are different kinds of black hole at different scales. And it looks like stars are not formed by accretion. Although that's probably involved. But, well, this goes quite deep in all directions. But we're trying to keep this simple. I'm sorry, I probably should not have given you that much information. But I am trying to tantalize you to show you that this is maximally synthetic. It synthesizes all of our knowledge, such that our understanding can now proceed to synthesis at the universal level. Einstein had a special reference frame for relativity, a 4-component number system with a 3-1 split. And what was his frame of reference? Zero. When he developed general relativity, another 4-component number system, really the same one, but it has a different quality, worth studying if you like, although you'll go insane. It's also a 3-1 split. Why is it general? What's the difference between general and special? Nothing. They're exactly the same. And nobody knows that because the formulation for general relativity is forced to apply to gravity, which is incorrect. But it works. And that's because of a superposition on perpendicularity, where the perpendicularity in orthospace, which is 3D or 4D linear, is matched by a spherical right angle, which I discovered, and you're seeing it in this diagram. That is a spherical right angle. The blue line can be computed with binary numbers. And so we now can penetrate the quantum. We can compute what we cannot see or measure. What we're measuring is forced into linear mode, which is single component mode. Complexification partially solves that, but the price is too high, and it also does not solve the problem. The other tool that was developed to get at curvature, to ultimately understand what's over here, essentially, Newton developed the differential calculus in order to get a 2-component rate off of a curve. A curve must be computed as a 2-component number because it's neither x nor y. In cubic space, everything is a combination of x and y. Here, it's still a combination of x and y, but you must not separate them. because they're in physical relationship. And now I'm going to show that to you and end this so I can go get some coffee, some iced coffee. It's in the 90s now. So you've heard of light speed. What is it? Well, it's the relationship between space and time because it's distance over time. It's the amount of distance that a photon travels in a certain amount of time. The problem there is time, because that cannot be defined linearly. Time is not linear. Well, it turns out that space is not linear either. So why does that goddamned formula work? Well enough for geopositioning and spaceflight. Why does that work? It's because this spherical orthogonality is the integral of any ortholinearity. Any hard right angle in linear single component space might represent a physical orthogonality, which is represented here. So to terminate this, so I can finally explain this to you correctly, I'm now going to show you what is light speed. Now you may know that light is composed of two quantizable quantities, which is kind of redundant. One of them is frequency, and the other one is wavelength. You may remember that Max Planck discovered that. He didn't discover that exactly, but he was forced to consider it. That what is light? Well, it's frequency and wavelength, correct? All right, what's the relationship? Is there a relationship between frequency and wavelength? Oh, yes. They're reciprocal numbers. And to represent any wave of light, all you need is one. All you need is one of those two. I think you're starting to see the profundity of two-ness. Light speed is a two-component number. But is time one of the quantities? No. That's not a quantity. That's a derivative. You could say that it's a derivative quantity, but you have to be cautious because you cannot use irrational numbers. They don't exist. The universe is quantized, but on its own counting system that begins not at 0, it begins at 1, and it splits to an in-out proportion. If you draw the binary number system, there is no 0. So how would you represent it on a line? Well, you can't, because a line has to have a 0 to balance the two polar infinities. So that 0 does exist in additive space, because the two infinities add to 0. In real space, you have to switch from a 1D axiomatization up to 2, 3, and 4D. You must not begin at 0D. You must begin with a two-component number, and that cannot be 0. So, the next possible number for an Archimedean would be 1. Well, we've known this for centuries. We do have two Archimedean numbers. Two Archimedean numbers, not one. So there are two possible frames of reference for the universe. Albert Einstein used special relativity, which has a reference frame of 0. So that's wrong. And then he generalized it, but it still has a reference frame of 0. The light cone goes out from 0. And so the origin is always 0. That's also the center of the supermassive black hole according to insane mathematics, because it looks like gravity must converge to 0. That's an infinity. So that doesn't work, and even Neil deGrasse Tyson admits that, but nobody has any answer, because they're blind. Well, I'm going to give you vision. So when you realize that there's a different Archimedean, you must ask if you're a geometrician or geometer, however you say that, which I am, the foremost geometer of all time. What do I say? Since I'm the man, maybe I can tell you. I'd better be able to, or I'm not a scientist. So when you look at light speed, right? Well, that's a two-component number. It's exactly 3 over 1. Or you could just say unitize it. Just make it 1. That's done all the time, by the way. It's called unitization. If you're a mathematical genius, you can do it. It works. And it's quite helpful. So very often light speed is considered to be 1. It turns out that's correct. So, as a geometer or a geometrician, I now must show that to you geometrically. On the line, you have an Archimedean of 0 based on the operator add. That's so you can have distance on the positive trajectory. You can measure a distance to a star because your point of origin is 0. But that's also the reference frame for the entire line if you make the mistake of accepting negative quantities. There are no such things, and so 0 and the negative numbers were discovered incorrectly because Euclid began incorrectly. He began with a 0D point, and that's a mistake because that's the Archimedean of the line. It works. It's superpositional. So the miracle of linear geometry, which the great creator told us we had to learn first, so we had no choice. We learned it first. 2,500 years later, it's broken because we need to know more. We need to know what is at the edge. Therefore, we need to know what's at the center. That's currently called the quantum paradox. Easily solved, but only when you switch to the binary number system, because instead of beginning with a line based on a point, you begin with another Archimedean that is not a point. Well, what is it? It's a circle. It's a circle on the plane. A circle is a planar object. If you take a ring, such as this ring on my finger, I've done this experiment in front of children so they can grok on it. That's a circle. But if you hold it just right and flick it to spin it, you see how a circle turns into a sphere on motion. And that's extremely profound. But we need the proof now. So, the true Archimedean of mathematical space is one of two. What I proved in 2022 is the entire linear number system, which is the entire surreal number tree of John Horton Conway, is the diameter of a sphere. So that's quite simple to prove. That's called the antipodal theorem, as I named it. And then from that we can go on to the bootstrap theorem, which rationalizes infinity in real space. So let's do that now on the simplest possible presentation of the absolute basis of mathematics and physics right now. It's a new perception of geometry based on the fact we know that 0 is the additive identity because it doesn't change any addition operation. 0 has no effect on add. But 1 is the multiplicative identity, as it's called. I'll teach you a new term. That is the proportional identity. It's the proportional identity. It's 1 over 1. It's 1 over 1. Don't write it that way because it might make you think it's division. It's not division, although it's superpositional in the linear number system. It's called division because there's nothing else you can call it. The universe does not use division. It uses proportion on existing quantities. That's the goal. All right. So what is the object for 1 over 1? It can be proved, and I'm going to prove now, it's a circle on the plane. In real space, what's called physical space, it's a sphere because it's equidistant in all directions. All right. When that's planarized, which is a form of linearization, you're collapsing the sphere to a circle. So you can think of the circle as representing the sphere. If you do, you're right and you'll never be wrong. The circle and the sphere are almost identical in two-component space. And it's quite interesting to see how the circle differs from the sphere. In my work, I didn't discover this, but there's a known constant relationship between any sphere and its circle. Because every sphere rotates. Every sphere in the universe rotates. And so that is the eigen of the sphere, is a circle. And that has a fixed mathematical relationship. All right. Now, we're hypothesizing that as 0 is the center of the line. Why? It's because it balances two infinities. Okay, using that idea that 0 is the balance point of two linear infinities on add, we can translate that, and we're taking a two-componency approach, so we now switch to the plane. We completely bypass the line. We don't use 0D to begin. We don't use 1D to begin. We use the plane, which is part of our consciousness. That plane that we can imagine in our own mind is you would have to say, a boundless plane. Well, what's the shape of the edge? I'm going to prove to you that it's circular. It would have to be. Because volume space, if you go out, it goes out spherically. Even the cosmologists admit that. It has to be spherical. So that's one direction going out. On the plane, you see exactly the same thing, but it's collapsed. So the circle can get bigger. Well, how far can it go? Well, it goes to infinity. Oh, that's a problem. Well, it was a problem for the line too. And so we just made a new infinity to balance the two linear infinities. That's 0. That's its function on the entire line. It's the Archimedean balance of the entire system. All the positive and negative numbers cancel to 0, including the two infinities. Now, infinity is problematical for reasons I'm sure you're able to intuit. So all we're doing is taking the same problem of two infinities. But in circular space, what would those be? There's only one infinity now. Well, no. There have to be two. You know why? Because if you have an edge, you have to have a center. So we're going to say that those are two infinities that need to be balanced. They need to be proportionalized. That will be in conjugal space, not polaric space. So it's actually a spherical right angle. Here, a circular right angle. That's a lot of information. I hope you're keeping up, but you can always listen to this again. I have several presentation series in the past that do a much better job of really getting into the tedious detail. But I'm trying to summarize this for you so that you'll see that the circle is the non-Euclidean point. It's the center of the system. It's 1. But it's a two-component number because it's in the plane. It's relating two quantities. Well, since those are linear, on the plane, those two quantities have to be orthogonal. And now I'll show that to you in circular space. But it's not a cross. It's not this. Because then you need two single component numbers to parameterize the circle. That's called sine and cosine. That's a mistake, because those are irrational numbers. So we need the rationalization of circular space. So we can rationalize the plane so we don't use squares. We need circles. So how do we do that so that it remains mathematically consistent? Very easily. If you say that the circle has a value of 1 proportion 1, which you should think in your mind and write as I do, 1:1. It means exactly the same thing as 1 over 1, but without the superpositional nuance of division, which does not apply in physical space. Division is a highly artificial operation, and it doesn't really exist as named. Because there's a better name, it's proportionality between two quantities, which is fixed. Now, what is that in the universe? It's light speed. We know that. That's a fixed relation. But is it between space and time? Let's consider the circle as being 1 proportion 1. That's the proportion of the linear aspect and the conjugal linear aspect. Because that's a right angle, not polaric. So the plane consists of two linear quantities. But if you separate them, you fail and get modern physics. If you unite them into their true number system, then 1 is the relationship between two quantities that's fixed. Well, 1 proportion 1 is simply a known identity. It's interesting that 1 times 1 equals 1, and 1 divided by 1 equals 1. I just mentioned that to show you this is extremely profound and ultimately enlightening. This might blow your mind to the next level. That is the goal of science, is to blow your mind to higher consciousness. If you're not going in the direction of God, it won't do you any good at all, because you're trying to unite your mind with the mind of your Creator, as He revealed His mind to you with physics. So this is reality for real. Now we have a circle. That is not a line. Can you see a difference between the circle and the line? I'm forcing you to look. The line is open, so you can only make an extrinsic geometry if you continue to use lines, all the way up to 4 lines, which Einstein used. One of them having to be imaginary, obviously. So, instead of cubifying space or hypercubifying it, we want to begin with a sphere if we can. We begin with a plane, because that's how we must begin, which is 2 linear numbers. 1 proportion 1 makes a new object that is not a line. So we begin with non-Euclidean geometrization of the plane, which now has both the horizontal and vertical aspects captured in 1 proportion 1. It's vertical 1, proportion horizontal 1, making a rational number. It's a computable number. It's a representable number. 1, you could say, is being dimensionalized. But the actual 1 is 1 proportion 1. That's a physical 1. Just 1 of something doesn't have much meaning unless you're computing distance. All right, you should understand that, but this is worth a lot of thought. I guarantee you that. So now we have a new object called the circle that parameterizes the plane with numbers. Oops, we haven't done that. Oh my God. Well, we have 1 number. We also have 2 aspects. There's an inside to the circle and an outside. The inside goes to an infinitesimality, which converges on 0. So we don't even lose linear 0. You could say that that 0 is at the center of the circle. We always do, so we might as well continue to say so. But you're going to see something interesting in a second. That 0 doesn't actually exist. And the universe does not have a 0. But it does have a 1, which is light speed. That's what I'm going to show you. That circle, 1 proportion 1, you can't say that it represents light speed yet, because there's no variation between the 2 quantities. But if you say that 1 is that surface, that's the discovery of intrinsic geometry, I am that discoverer, that there's an inside and an outside. Well, just as you had plus and minus numbers, here you must have 2 sets of numbers that are in direct relation. If you go plus 1 and minus 1, they continue to add to 0 all the way to infinity. So plus infinity on the line and minus infinity on the line are exactly equivalent infinities. But if it can be proved that that's 1 infinity, and that means that that's the diameter of a circle. So if you do say that, you get an answer. And it's simply add. That's add. You're using add. You add plus and minus numbers to 0 to balance the system. That's add. Well, what about the other paired operator? That's for the circle. So it's multiplication. So this is called multiplicative space. But nobody's ever seen this. Remarkable, yes? That if you have a circle that represents 1, it's just think of it as 1. So the circumference of the unit circle, the new unit circle, I call it the omega circle because the unit circle puts 1 on the radius. That ruins everything. You're only using 1 aspect of 2-component space. But if you integrate it, and this is actually the calculus integral, the basic idea behind the calculus integral is to integrate two separate numbers into a rate. So this number 1 is a rate. It's the rate around the circle. And don't worry about that yet. We're simply trying to put the numbers onto the plane. When the numbers were put onto the plane on the line, you need a second line to get the second aspect. In this system, both vertical and horizontal aspects are integrated into one number. So it's a rate. So accept that. And so now that has a number. And that's the only correct definition of 1. Unity is a circle because it has a surface. It is the simplest surface. In real space, it's a sphere that defines a proton, an electron, and a photon, which is everything. So everything in the universe is spherical. The photon is the one we're after here. But then I'm going to show you in this diagram, you're going to see it for the proton and then for the electron. So you get the exact mathematical relationship between all of those things. So we want to understand how to parameterize the plane with two-component numbers. We now have one of those numbers. It's balanced. Remember, this is the balance between two infinities. Well, if you go in, you go to one infinity. When you go out, you go to the other infinity. Those must multiply to 1. So we're going to give infinity a two-componency representation. It's perfectly reasonable to do so. We'll say that the edge is infinity over 1. And since infinity is imaginary, a moment's thought will convince you of that, infinity is an imaginary number. So we're using an imaginary number in relationship to unity. So it's lazy 8 colon 1. I'm drawing it with the bar, which has a name. And so infinity over 1 is a two-component representation of infinity. Can it be linearized? It certainly can. Just remove the 1. And now you have infinity, which is imaginary. So we're saying that the imaginary infinity on the outside is in relation to unity on the inside. Correct? So we're just going to accept that and see if we can make something out of it. Well, if infinity over 1 is 1 infinity, then the center is 1 over infinity. If infinity over 1 is the outermost binary number such that it's an imaginary binary number, it has to have a complement. It's actually the conjugal number so that they both multiply to 1. Just as the two linear infinities add to 0, the two circular infinities multiply to 1. Is 1 over infinity less than 1? It's infinitely less than 1. So that is an infinity and it is imaginary. And that's inside the circle. Its complement, its conjugal, is the exterior infinity of the entire plane, which must also be imaginary because you can't reach it. You can't jump high enough to touch it. Your linear number system cannot reach it for the same reason it can't reach linear infinity, because it's infinite. That's imaginary. So we have two imaginary numbers now flanking 1. One of those numbers is inside the circle and is less than 1. The other number is infinitely far away outside the circle and it's greater than 1. Correct? Multiply them. So they multiply to the circle. And that's the exact equivalent of Euclidean geometry translated to planar geometry, which cannot be Euclidean. You cannot use the line but it's embedded. I proved that in 2022. Although it was known, I proved it in a new way. So now we have the entirety of the plane represented with numbers, including the imaginary edge. And so what's real about this? You have to find an actual number. These two imaginary numbers can never be used. The only reason they exist is conjugally they imply each other. So the center of the circle is 1 over infinity. That's circular infinity. And the edge number is circular infinity over 1. As one number, that's a 2-component number, which makes one number. So what are the 2 components of this 2-component number make? So that we have a number. It makes 1. So that's consistent. Now you do have to say that it's 1 over 1. And remember, I told you that is exactly the same thing as 1 proportion 1. And 1 is a magic number, because 1 times 1 is also 1. It's a very interesting thing to say, but I don't want to deviate because we're already at 80 minutes. I'm going to leave it at that and continue because I'm sweating. I'm sweating, pouring sweat. I can't afford to turn on the AC. I have to go get some iced coffee, which technically I can't afford either, but hey, I'm having the time of my life. I hope you are too. Please tune in for the next video lecture, which I think will be later today after I'm refreshed. And we'll talk about this diagram and the speed of light, which is essentially 1 over 2 times 2 over 1. And you'll see that one of those numbers is inside the circle because it's less than 1, and the other number is outside the circle, creating space. So space is created as the conjugal number is what? Going inside? No, it's perpendicular. So the circle itself is either wavelength or frequency, right? No. The relationship here is as the circles are generated outward all the way short of infinity, you can keep going 2, 4, 6, 8. These are bigger and bigger circles because the smallest circle is 1. Well, what's inside? It's imaginary. And there's no polarity relationship between going out and going in. As this goes out, something happens on the circle. So this is the relationship between space, which now has a dimension, and energy, which is the circle, and that is light speed. Because if you put 2 dots on the circle, that's called a dihedron, you split the circle into wavelength-frequency relationship, right? So the frequency is 2, those are the 2 points, and that makes the circle 1/2, 1/2. So the new periodicity is 1 over 2 to the proportion that the wavelength is the reciprocal. So the number of points defines a fraction going in. It's going on the line. That is the closed line. You have to divide it not according to a spatial concept, but a temporal concept. But it's not time. Time is only one of the aspects. That's frequency. The other one is wavelength. That wavelength is not in space. It's at the surface of space. And that's the quantum. We'll be right back. I have to... I'm pouring sweat, so thank you for tuning in. We'll have more.